Welcome to my YouTube channel, Surowicz Watercolor. At any time during this video, you can click on the icon in the lower right hand corner and subscribe to my channel. And if you enjoy this, be sure to share with your friends and comment. This is the narrated step-by-step tutorial for my painting, Yellow Creek. The photograph on the right was a reference for this painting. It's a view from the sidewalk looking down into the small town of Peninsula, Ohio in the Cuyahoga Valley National Park. There's a slight grade as the road slopes down into the town, and I wanted to try and capture that feeling. I wanted to capture the feeling of depth that's in this scene. There's very distant trees and trees that get closer to you in the middle ground and all the way up to right here in the foreground where there's some trees and some foliage very close. And I wanted to have linkage with the lights and the darks throughout the composition. So these are some of the things that I was focusing on as I developed this painting. And there's many areas where I simplified. I wanted to provide just enough information to tell the story. It's not an attempt to do a photorealistic copy of the photograph. I did a light sketch of my subject on a quarter sheet of 140-pound cold press watercolor paper. It's 11 inches by 15 inches. But before I even did my sketch on my paper, I did a thumbnail sketch in my sketchbook and a value study. This isn't much bigger than 2 by 3 inches, and I drew the thumbnail sketch using a ink pen, and then I did the value study using grayscale markers. As I did my value sketch, I'm thinking about value dominance in the foreground, middle ground, and background. I want to create distance, so I need to determine where the dominant values are going to be placed in those areas. And I also wanted to get some linkage, interlocking shapes with my values. I'll use this value study as a guide as I develop my painting. After I did my value study, I did my light pencil sketch on my quarter sheet of paper that I'm going to be painting on. Before I begin, I'll go through the colors that I use in this painting. Cerulean blue, royal blue, sap green, pyrrole red, rose madder quinacridone, Hansa yellow, quinacridone burnt orange, raw sienna, and raw umber. These are the main colors that I used in this painting. I might have used a touch of a few others throughout the painting. And one thing I'll mention about color, I know people always want to know what color is used in the painting. One of the things to think about is becoming less dependent on specific tube names of color and what color did an artist use for this or what color did an artist use for that. And think a little bit more about the color wheel. What are the colors going around the color wheel? So instead of thinking rose madder quinacridone and what did you mix with it to get this color, think about it in terms of a red violet or a blue violet or a blue green or a yellow green. And think, what do I need to do to make a yellow green or a violet or a blue violet? If you start thinking of those terms and start thinking about what it takes to mix those colors, you become less dependent on knowing what everybody's using in every tube of paint that they touch. And the next step is to start working in neutral versions of those colors. If you can start to paint the color wheel and start to paint the inner core with some of the neutrals, you'll become more independent, and it'll help you develop as an artist. I'm going to begin by putting down a very light valued wash, and I'm going to be blocking in some large areas of light value, and I'm going to cut these washes in around some of the shapes where I want to preserve the white of the paper. Sometimes I'll use masking or frisket, but in this case we're just going to use direct painting. So I'm going to cut this wash around the shapes in the areas that I want to preserve the white and the light. And in essence, what I'm going to start to do here is I'm going to build up a middle value layer. And when I'm done, you'll be able to see where the pure whites are going to remain in my composition. So I'm not seeing individual objects right now. I'm seeing large shapes of value. I'm not looking at a roof or a door or a road. I'm looking at the diagonals, the shapes, the squares, the rectangles, the triangles, the edges of things, but just blocking in this value. And then while it's still wet, I'm started wet on dry here, so that's going to give me nice clean edges, but I'm going to start to work within this wash using wet in wet techniques. This will work particularly well for areas in the distance. Working wet in wet will give you soft, diffuse edges. Things in the distance aren't as clear, they're a little hazy, sometimes they tend to be a little cool. And this is a good time to start doing some of this background work. A lot of times when I'm doing landscapes, I'll start in the background and I'll move forward. And as I do this, I start to build my values, and often I start to get more detail as I come forward. And because we'll be building our painting and developing our painting with darker and darker values as we go, I can paint some of these large areas without concern whether I'm filling in a window or a roof or a tree, because they're all one shape of value, irregardless of color. That being said, as I do start to do some brushwork here in this wet and wet areas of the paper, of the composition, I'm going to start to establish some warm and cool colors in those areas that will be a bit of a roadmap as I develop my painting. This is a very neutral mixture that I have down here. You just need, this is just a slightly warm gray tone. There's a number of ways to get that. So I pretty much have this area that I want blocked in. And now I'm going to start to introduce some more color into this and a slightly darker value. It's still not going to be a very dark value, and it's going to be a subtle color, a neutral color. It's not, it doesn't have a lot of intensity. So this is a mixture with some sap green, some royal blue, a little bit of red in it, a little raw sienna, and it's leaning towards the cool side of things. Has a touch of royal blue cooling things down. So it's more or less a light towards middle value gray, and it's cool, but I'm putting in some touches of warm gray too. So this is where I'm saying it's important to really develop your ability to mix specific tones and colors, irregardless of what the tube name is. These colors are warm and cool grays. They're light value. And now I'm starting to introduce some green here. This is some sap green with a little bit of pyrrole red. I know that I don't want to use pure sap green. Sometimes I have touches of it in there, but I normally neutralize a little bit. I move a little bit towards the neutral pole to make it feel more natural, and I do that by adding some red. I often use pyrrole red, but I can also use rose madder. And those are the things to think about. What do I want to do? I want a neutral green here. How can I mix that? And this is where I stress trying to practice some of this on scraps of paper and get confident in mixing your colors, because when you're trying to create a finished painting, it's not the time to try and learn some of these techniques, because you're going to get frustrated and you're not going to develop very good painting because you're too worried about trying to figure out how to mix paint instead of just executing your painting. So do some of that stuff as exercises and on scraps of paper. And hopefully you can see now I have that kind of almost a violet, cool violet gray in the background that represents a large area of distant trees and city and town and everything. And I'm starting to move forward. I have this these green tones starting to take shape. All these mixtures that I'm going to be working in here right now are just different combinations of royal blue, sap green, pyrrole red, a little bit of burnt orange, and occasionally a rose madder. But varying the ratios of those colors can give me a variety of tones, and to help differentiate some of the areas within large shapes of, say, greenery and these green tones, I move from warm to cool, and here I've let this mixture lean more towards the red side. So I have cool green, I have warm green, I have earthy reds that are created by mixing with greens, and I'm working wet and wet, so I get a nice gradation of these colors working on the paper. And my values aren't very dark yet, so this is more or less becoming an underpainting here that I'm going to build the level of detail that I want with increased value, harder edges, more refined shapes. Areas of this paper are still quite saturated, and some areas are starting to get a little bit towards the damp side. And the paper doesn't dry evenly normally, and I work at an angle almost 98% of the time, and so my paint is often being pulled downward towards gravity, so the top areas of an area that I've applied paint tend to dry before some of the other areas. And this is very saturated here, but a little bit above and to the right of my hand there, starting to get some areas where it's starting to get damp. And one of the things I can do when my paper gets damp is I can scrape into it. And in my picture, I have some power lines and telephone lines and whatnot that are draping through there. So it's starting to get to the point where I can use my scraping tool and push some of that paint to scrape some of those marks in there. This is where it's very important that you understand moisture content. If you don't understand the condition of your paper and what you can do at that point in time, you'll tend to struggle, and that's one of the big challenges with watercolor. If you don't have an understanding, you're going to struggle. So here, this is still very wet and wet. I'm putting in a little darker value, some cooler tones, and this is getting more towards the middle foreground here. And you can see that kind of violet wash that I put down that just gradated very lightly into the sky, and just a suggestion of something back there. I could have gone a little stronger with that value and probably could have just a little bit more violet, but I'm going to leave it as it is. And I'm going to touch just a little bit of a bright green here. This is sap green with a little bit of hands of yellow. Just a few areas when I preserve a little bit of color intensity amongst that white shape. Now, as I said, it's a good time for me to do some scraping. So I can give an indication of these trees. It's still a little saturated here. That's why I'm getting some dark lines along with some of the white lines. But here, you can see that I can scrape. Some areas are actually a little too dry to scrape. It's a very narrow window that you have because you're actually pushing paint. You're not damaging the paper. You're moving the paint, and there's not enough moisture for it to flow back in, so it leaves the white line. And because this is over a large area, I have different degrees of moisture left in my paper. It's dried at different rates because the application varied, and the gravity has an effect on that. I've inserted the reference photo, and one of the things I want to mention here is when I put these lines in, I'm not trying to copy every power line that's in my photo. I'm giving a suggestion of this linear feature that's swinging down in my composition and coming across, and I'm just trying to pick up the suggestion of that. I'm not counting the power lines and trying to paint every one of them. It's just not this. That's not that type of a painting. Now I'm going to continue on applying my middle value wash. It's actually a light middle value. And I'm still thinking shapes. I'm thinking about the spaces between what are these poles, but I think of them more as light shapes, dark shapes. It doesn't really matter. Those poles run into the house. So I'm painting the negative space that appears in between some of the features on the house, and I'm using just a mixture of a somewhat earthy green here with sap green and some pyro red in it, a little bit of royal blue. And You'll often see me use a tissue or my hand or touch the paper or blot it just to break it up a little bit, make the area look a little more interesting. It creates some variation within the wash. So I'm using this quill brush that I like to use, and I'm not really trying to paint detail. It's just some of these are very narrow shapes that I'm painting in between some of the elements of the building. So I am using a fine point here. You're starting to see the shape of this sign take shape, but it's not because I'm painting the sign, it's because I'm painting the shapes around it. I'm defining that sign by painting off its exterior edge, and I'm painting this area of negative space that surrounds that sign. So these are seeing positive and negative shapes. And again, I'm putting down this green wash as a large shape, even though it's covering different areas. It's covering parts of the building, parts of bushes, and I'm not trying to paint those individual objects again. You'll hear me frequently, as I'm sure you know, saying shape, 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 and that's what I'm looking at. Right now there's a lot of connectivity between the pure white of the paper that's leading from that road down in the valley all the way up here to the sidewalk and into the house, and I want to try and keep some of that connectivity all the way through the finished stages of this painting. You see now my paper is very saturated right there. I'm just coming in with a warmer mixture there. It's leaning more towards red, and letting that just mix on the paper. It's much more interesting to have washes that are charged with a variety of color than just a flat tone that you mixed on your palette, and that it's 100% just that flat tone. So it's always interesting when you can come in and let some of those mixtures interact on the paper. And one of the things I'm doing though is I'm maintaining the value. So even though I'm doing color changes, I'm maintaining the value. And another thing, keep in mind, just because you change color doesn't mean you change value. Sometimes people think, well, I've gone to a different value because I changed my color. That's not always the case. You can have the same value: red, brown, gold, blue, purple, violet, green. And just because you go from one to the other doesn't necessarily mean you've changed your value. And in this case, I don't want to change my value. Now I've thoroughly dried my paper, and I'm going to come in here with a mixture that has some sap green with some hands of yellow in it. And I want some nice bright greens. So I want to have some color intensity, and you're going to get your brightest colors when you apply them to the pure white paper. So some of these areas where I've preserved the white of the paper at this stage are not going to remain white, but they're going to allow me to come in with a more intense color and put that down and get and retain the brightness of that and the intensity. So I'm taking this mixture here with the sap green and some hands of yellow, and I started with some direct painting there, and I'm still painting on wet on dry, but I'm going to let that kind of gradate a little bit here in this area and cover a larger area with this wash. And you can see that I've added a little bit of a red tone in there. Now I'm going to move some of that bright green, that intense color, up to this other area in the composition. And so that's going to help create some balance and some harmony across my painting. It's going to share some of that bright tone with the other side of the composition. Now I'm going to start to paint some more of this foreground area, and first I'm thinking middle value, and then next I'm thinking color. So I'm not thinking any particular color as my first thought. I'm just thinking that it needs to be this middle value, and it's actually a red violet tone that's leaning towards neutral. And here again I'm just blocking in some areas of value around some of these other areas, these shapes, these elements that are in the composition. Some of them will be painted over, some of them will be left the white or light tones. And here you can see I've switched up from a red-violet to more of a violet and letting those colors mingle on the paper. There's some gradation going on. Now I'm going to go back to my bright green and I'm going to start to paint some of the areas that are going to represent some of the leaves that are on this tree in the foreground. And this is something that has to be layered properly, has to be sequenced properly. That's why I needed to save the white of the paper here in this area, because I want to have this bright green. And I can't come back and put that on top of a middle value wash and retain the intensity, the brightness of the color. This is why you have to plan and think about sequence when you paint. But this is going to carry this green tone throughout my composition. It's going to help balance that color. I'm going to try and put some touches. So some of those areas where I put some of those touches of that color and there towards the back, towards the middle round. It wasn't necessarily because I looked at my photo and I saw something that said to put that light green there. I just wanted to help distribute some of that color through my composition. It was driven more by design than a reference photo. A lot of times when I'm painting like this, I use the reference photo just to keep the theme going, but it's strictly that, a reference photo. A lot of times I'm just making shapes that I feel are interesting or improve the design. It's not copying the photo. I refer to it occasionally, but I'm not constantly throughout the painting process. I also look at my value study. I pay probably as much attention to my value study as I do the photo, because I'm trying to maintain that value structure in my painting. Now I'm just going to put a light wash here to tone down another area here, and just again as a large shape of a light value around some of the elements in the composition. So little by little you can start to see where the areas of white are going to weave through my composition. Here I'm going to start to define a shadowed area here, and this shape is going to start to give some structure to the building here that's on the side. It's going to start to carve that out of what's going on there, and some windows, just little brush strokes to indicate some windows. And here, just painting some shadows that start to define the gutters and the eaves of the roof. So now I'm going to start to paint this tree, and this tree is going to be a darker value when I'm finished, but it kind of has three large segments that come together to form the trunk. And I'm using a mixture here of quinacridone burnt orange, some royal blue, a little raw umber, a little bit of raw sienna, a few different combinations here to give me some warm and cool tones. And I'm getting this very wet. And at the moment I'm using a 1/2 inch flat brush. And now as I bring this down, I need to paint around that sign. So just as I described the shape of that sign by painting the bottom of it and around the bottom in negative space, I'm doing the same here with this tree. So you can see those colors, warm and cool colors, starting to mingle in that trunk. And I'm going to drop a little bit of a darker tone in there, cool tone. I need to get some darker values in there, and I want a little bit more intense color. So I'm continuing to work with the same colors. I'm just going to mix a richer mixture on my palette. Here you can see that royal blue. And it doesn't bother me that I just painted blue on my tree. Now I have some of the quinacridone and burnt orange. I had somebody ask me one time, what color are trees? When you paint trees, what color are they? And I said they're a reflection of their environment. They can be all kinds of different colors depending on the light and where they're at, the placement. They're basically reflected light. I mean, they have a color to them, but when you look at them, they can be a rainbow of colors. Too often people think of trees as they're just brown. And now I'm going to take my scraping tool here. And this paper is saturated, so it's not really damp, which is what I normally do scraping on, but I'm making big marks, so I'm removing large areas of pigment. I'm pushing large areas of pigment. I'm not making narrow lines that would, if I was, they would fill back in. But I can take this scraping tool and just really scrape some paint and suggest some textures here. I'm not taking a little brush and trying to paint bark. I'm just, again, as I use that word a lot, I'm just suggesting the tree. And I'm going to come back and touch up a little bit of that, but I'm going to retain some of the elements that I like. Now I need to fill in a little bit around the top of that sign where it's got an oval shape sitting on it. So I'm using a finer brush, but I'm using the same mixture that I was using in the rest of that tree, because that's what's coming through now. That's actually negative space that I was just painting. Now I'm going to continue that tree underneath the sign. So that starting and stopping helps to find the edge of the sign without really painting it. And you can tell that this tree is in distance because of the overlap, and that color carries, that tone colors behind the sign down and comes out at the bottom. And I've broken that up to try and keep that an interesting shape at the bottom. Next I'm going to take a dark value. I'm going to paint this utility pole that's to the right side of the composition. I'll be using a mixture of quinacridone burnt orange, royal blue with some rose madder quinacridone in it. And you can see that I get a nice coverage with just a nice bold stroke bringing it down. I had a fully loaded brush on dry paper, and then I just blotting that just to break that up and make that much more interesting rather than just leaving it a flat wash. I'm going to take some of that same tone, and I'm going to take my quill brush and just give a little bit more indication of these tree shapes here. Just making some linear marks. And I like to break these shapes up. I don't just make a complete solid line. Now I'm going to paint this lamppost. Even though it's going to be a dark middle value to dark valued shape, I still left some of this area open because there's some color I want to work into it, and there'll be some white highlights that I want to maintain. And this would be a good example of, even though I'm painting local color, I like to get some variety in my wash that I'm applying. I don't just want to paint a solid tone all the way down and across the whole fixture. This lamppost has some interesting color in it, and I'm going to use this neutral that I've mixed. So this is like a neutral gray, and I'm highlighting some of it with some touches of green, and I'm actually using a little Viridian this, which wasn't one of the colors that I listed at the start, because I just used a few touches of Viridian in this lamppost and a couple touches elsewhere, but not too much. So I'm painting the shadowed side of this lamppost, and you can see that it's not just a flat wash that I've put down. Here I put some water, I'm letting it gradate. There's some areas where I've disturbed the application of wash, and it's created a little bit of texture in it. So I want to have some variety. And now, I started wet on dry. I'm working wet on wet, and I can just drop some dark value in there. I'm going to bring that down and start to define the base of the lamppost. And because I waited to paint over this area and I didn't put a wash on, I have some white highlights that I can retain just by direct painting around some of those areas. So I'm going to have a few highlights, just touches of pure white paper. Another way to achieve that would be to use some masking, but I'm not using any of that in this painting. Now I'm going to paint the top of this lamppost, and here I have some Viridian, and you can see some of that Viridian coming through, that light's going through the paper and reflecting back. This is another reason that I didn't want to glaze over this area, because I wanted to have just some bright accents of color here. Even though it's very dark in some of the areas, there's going to be just touch of this kind of a blue-green coming through. Here, as I paint the frame of this lamppost, I'm not going to get too fussy with it. I'm going to draw some of these vertical elements, or paint them, and just a suggestion there, and you can see that line kind of starts, disappears, and that can be reflections, it can be shadows, but I didn't want to just draw straight lines from the base all the way up around that globe. Just want to break things up a little bit. I like to have start and stop edges and lines. Now there's some flower pots sitting out here. I'm going to use some quinacridone and burnt orange with a little blue, royal blue in them to paint these. And that's the inside of these pots. And now I'm going to paint the edges and the base of the pot. And again, here, because I left white paper, I can paint around the edges and define those edges by working in negative space around the edges. And I have the pure white paper preserved because I left that area white when I was putting down my wash. And now if we look at those 4 flower pots that are on the ground there, see how that burnt orange tone carries from one to the other, and they're linked, and it's really one continuous shape. It's broken up by the edges and stuff, but although it suggests that there's these separate flower pots, and we know they're separate flower pots, they're really linked together. That's just one flat wash over a connected shape. I want to pick up a little bit more of a warm tone in a few spots here, because it's predominantly a cool painting. I picked up a little bit of a red tone there to help accent the flower pots, and the little red that I put on the sign there, just to put those warm accents and create a little bit of balance on my composition. And here I'm going to paint this railroad crossing sign, and I'm not going to fuss with it too much. I'm painting the yellow shape there, and a couple touches of that same tone in a few spots, and that just helps balance the composition. I actually moved the railroad sign down a little bit from where it's at, and then my reference photo was a little closer to us, but it didn't really work well in the composition, so I took the liberty to move that down a little bit. just putting a light glaze, kind of a gold tone on this lamp globe here, where the bulb's at, where the light's at. And I'm not going to fuss with it too much, just give enough of an indication that there's something going on there. There's some glass. I'm going to just take a little bit of a neutral, very light neutral blue and paint over this sign to tone it down a little. One of the things about this sign, it's in a very predominant area, but I don't want the viewer just to zero in on this sign, so I'm toning down the area a little bit. I'm not going to leave it the pure white of the paper. And also, I'm going to paint some of the letters on that sign, but I'm not going to make it like a billboard. I'm going to break those up a little bit when I paint them and make it so it's not as noticeable. I don't want the viewer just to immediately go and start reading the sign. I'm going to take some of this cool gray, kind of a bluish tone, and help reinforce the curb and the edge of the road there, and help lead that viewer down that road to realize that that's going down into that valley area. And I also want to detail that sign a little bit, not a lot. I'm just going to give an indication of the crossing on that yellow shape, and put where the post is for the sign. So just put a touch of that there and an X there to suggest the railroad crossing sign. And these few marks that I've put here to indicate the edge of the curb or the grass or whatever are enough just to say that this is the edge of the road and the road's going down there. I don't have to get real detailed with it. There's a series of posts here in front of the building and alongside the road, so I'm going to give an indication of those right now. And I'm not using black, I'm using a mixture that has some royal blue, some quinacridone burnt orange, and some sap green in it. I actually don't have any black on my palette, I just mix whatever neutrals I need. I'm not going to overstate these, and just enough to suggest they're there. There's a little bit of overlap, some edges coming together, and now I'm going to give an indication of some shadows here. You can see, again, I like to blot sometimes with a tissue to break up a shape. It's hard to tell here, but if you look, I don't always use the point on my brush here. I'm kind of dragging the side of the brush to make my mark. An element of design that sometimes people forget about when they're doing their painting is direction. Direction can help define a surface. It can describe with very few brush strokes. Here, just this horizontal mark starts to suggest that that's a flat surface. And as I come in here around these planters that are sitting here on these cement slabs, this very angular shape that I'm painting, these brush strokes, help define the squareness and the flatness of those concrete pads with just very few brush strokes. If you paint the same level of detail everywhere in your painting, your entire painting, it can get very busy, very monotonous, and the viewer doesn't know where you want them to look. So you don't always have to tell the whole story, but be selective in your brush strokes so that they're describing an edge or they're describing a surface. Just make sure that there's value in the brush mark that you're putting down, and don't do it just because you see something in a photograph and it's there, so you're going to put it in your painting. There's a certain level of interpretation that comes into play. I'm going to stick the reference photo in the top right corner to get a quick look at how we're progressing. Hopefully you can start to see the patterns of light and value emerge as this painting develops. Here you can see this dark shape that I'm painting here on this bush, and it's similar to what's in that photo, and it actually is also what I have in my value pattern or my value study. So I've decided to keep that dark. There's times when I might alter a value in an area, and right now I'm painting wet on dry, and I have a fairly thick mixture to give me this dark green, which is made up of sap green with some pyro red and some royal blue, and it's giving me a very dark earthy green. And I'm not going to paint this whole shape. You can see I'm leaving the edge a little rough, a little bit of texture, and I'm just suggesting that that value is carrying down, and there's multiple bushes there without painting multiple bushes. It's just giving a dark edge to suggest that there's another section to that line of bushes, and then bringing this dark value up into the area where the building's at and painting some of that value in a negative space. So that gives the feeling of overlap, and that dark shape is moving behind these structures. Now I have that value working between the elements of that building, and I'm going to let that continue down into some of these shadows. So that same tone that I used on that bush is working its way behind the elements of the building and kind of coming down around front there into this area where there's some bushes or shrubs, and starting to define some of the shadowed areas, some of the areas underneath this. And it's the same mixture that I used on the other side there. So this is just going to describe the dark underside of this brush that's there, or the shrub. And just some touches on those poles, just a little bit to carry that value across. Now I'm going to also carry this tone. I don't want it to end on that post. I'm going to bring it on the other side of it. So every time you bring a shape to one edge of another shape and bring it out the other, you start to suggest overlap. And when you suggest overlap, that starts to suggest depth. So here, you know, when I'm looking at this, I'm looking at the photo a little bit, just saying, yeah, there's a dark side here. This is where the shadows are going to be. But I'm making these brush marks without using a reference photo. I'm just making marks that I feel are interested and that communicate that this is a dark shadowed area. I need to start to define the structure a little bit more. So I'm going to start using some dark values to define the structure, and the nature of my brush strokes are going to help. These are very angular marks. I'm defining some edges here as I do this, but I'm not painting a detail, a rendering of this building. I'm giving some suggestions here of shadow, of shape, of edge, and that's starting to bring out other areas. So this dark area that I'm painting, some of these marks, start to give form to some of these lighter areas. So you can see just by that little bit of a brushwork that I did there, starts to give that angular feel, which the viewer starts to know, oh, that's structure. That's not just trees there or foliage. And then I break that up because there is some tree there and there is some foliage. So that's not going to be a solid shape that doesn't have interruption. So it's a combination of the hard edges and then just little marks, some colographic marks that help describe that there's still edges of trees and leaves. So here again, some very angular marks using direction to help define what's going on there with the surface and with that is that structure. Here I'm going to make some more marks here, and just very subtle suggestion there of that edge is enough to describe that now I'm on the side of that building, and here I'm going at another angle, and that kind of takes me around to the front. So there wasn't a whole lot of brushwork there, but it really starts to bring some structure to that area and start to say building instead of that it's all tree up there or foliage. And now I'm going to paint another angular shape here with a middle value that will start to say that this is a shadowed side of the building. And then I'm describing that edge of the roof line there by painting that area in shadow, and then just a few touches with my brush here starts to describe the rest of that area. In the brushwork that I'm going to do now, I'm just using some middle values, a few dark values, and making some marks and some line just to help describe edges and bring a little bit more definition to the elements of this structure. So here, just a little bit of line, a couple dots, some dashes, just suggesting that there's some edges and some shadows and some interesting marks or elements to this whole structure. Doesn't take a lot. Now I'm going to carry some of that brushwork up more here in the foreground, and I need to carry it behind the lamppost in that area there, because really there's not much going on in terms of value. There's no connectivity of the shapes. That area, if you look on the right side of that large tree, there's a lot of activity, but if you go to the left, it's just kind of still a large light shape. So I need to move some of that calligraphy and some of that brushwork into that area so that it ties to the rest of the painting. Right now it kind of feels like things end at the tree and the lamppost. So here I'm doing some of that on this post, but I'm going to move over to the left in that area behind the lamppost and start to do some brushwork there. And this will start tying this part of the composition to the rest of the composition. There's some lattice or something there, some lattice work that leaves some empty squares or rectangles in between the cross members. So I'm just giving that indication there, and that comes all the way down. You can see how now that starts to feel more like part of the rest of the composition. It's not just a piece that's hanging out there. And I want to bring some of those same values to that area. And I still need to take some of those values on the left side of that lamppost, or it's just still going to feel isolated and not connected to the rest of the composition. There's a dark band of value that moves horizontally from the left to the right there. So that's going to help really connect it to what's going on, that shape. Now I'm taking my 1/2 inch flat brush with a fairly wet brush of a very dark value here. This is the same colors I've been using: royal blue, quinacridone and burnt orange, some raw umber. And you can see that I'm using this wet on dry. It's not a saturated brush, it's not dropping a bead, but it's a very damp brush. And I'm trying to get some texture as I do this. I want to create some texture here to suggest the bark. I use the tip of the brush. Just trying to get some variety here. And I came in earlier and put that initial wash on. I'm going to build darker values on top of it and just do enough to strengthen the structure of that tree and show some of the elements. Here you can see I'm using the side of the brush to give me a broken edge to create the texture. And I want to bring that down a little bit so that that feels connected to the rest of the tree, even though it's interrupted by a sign. Now I'm going to take a liner brush with my dark value that I was using on that tree, and I'm going to paint the ironwork that is hanging this sign. So I'm painting a strong horizontal here. And it's a fairly solid line that I've painted. I will break it up in some areas. And that piece that's coming down to that sign there is a bit of a tangent on that tree, but it's pretty much where it still has to go. I probably could have done a better job when I drew that in, that those pieces of iron are right on the edge of the tree. It would have been better if it was offset a little bit. And then there's some more that goes up and comes down from the post. So here I'm going to bring that line down to connect it. And there's a few more elements here of this ironwork. The one thing that this does is it gives some nice contrast of line here. I have these nice straight lines and then some curved lines. And that curved line there, that's that ironwork, also contrasts some of the edges on the tree. And there's some iron fence here below this that repeats some of those curved lines. It has a nice round arc on the top of the ironwork for this fence, so that carries the brushwork from the sign that I just did down to that fence, and it repeats those curved arcs. And those same shapes are repeated in the structure there, the porch as you go on. There's an arc there, there's a partial another arc there, so it just repeats those shapes and helps tie them together. Now I'm going to do some of the lettering on this sign. And even with this lettering, I'm going to be suggestive. I'm going to put enough information there that you can read it, but I don't want it to read like a billboard. I don't want it to be the first thing that hits you in the face when you look at this painting. So I just give just touches of the lettering. I lift my brush and I break it up, and it's not solid dark lines that I'm making here. So just kind of gets lost and found, and it's just enough to tell you what it's saying, but it's not going to do it in a way that it says, hey, come look at me, I'm a billboard. I'm going to continue with my liner brush here. I'm going to make some more of these linear marks to help repeat some of the narrow lines that I have on the left side of my composition, but picks it up in the trees. So some arcing lines, some straight lines. I want to stop and start it on the edge of that pole, just so it helps reinforce the overlap. And I'm going to take some of those marks here. There's some tree branches coming out on the edge of that roof. That helps further describe the edge of the roof there. So some branches here are coming out of the foliage. I want to get some more angled lines here. So there's just another layer of overlap. Varied the value in those a little bit too. These marks are a little darker than the first ones that I made. And I want to pick up some of that that linear brushwork in closer to the foreground here, down in these bushes. There'll be some branches coming out. So it's just repeating the linear brushwork that I have in the other areas of the trees at a little further distance. So it's just some repetition. And again, I'm using some straight, some arced lines. And they, again, help create overlap that helps build depth into the painting. I've thoroughly dried my paper, and I want to create some texture, so I'm going to take my coarse spray bottle. This is different than the one I used to generate a fine mist. This is going to spritz a spray of water onto, in particular, some of the dark shapes that I have here and some other areas. And I'm going to blot that with a tissue and gently rub the surface to lift some of that paint. You can start to see that texture appear. I'm going to spray it a couple times here and then keep lifting. And that just gives me a little bit more of an interesting pattern into some of these shapes. This area here by the tree doesn't really match some of the other areas here. I'm going to add a little bit more calligraphy, and I'm going to take my liner brush. I'm going to put a few branches coming out there that'll overlap that green shape that I put in earlier and make it fit the painting a little bit better. I'm going to put a white mat on this to get rid of the tape in the board. And there you have my painting, Yellow Creek. I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. If you want to find out more information about any of my sites, you can click one of the boxes appearing on the screen.